Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 5th of August, one of the most eventful days of this year. And that's saying something because this entire summer has been really volatile, especially today. But we're specifically looking at frontline changes, beginning with the Orikhiv axis, then going to the Pokrovsk Direction, finishing off with Toretsk, where we have so much news to cover, and Chasiv Yar. Before I do that, I just want to say that there is initial reporting about missile strikes towards Kiev, the general Kiev region. And so what's being reported by Russian sources as of now is that at least 6 missiles were launched, specifically KN-23 North Korean ballistic missiles and Iskander-M ballistic missiles that are regularly used by the Russians. And so just keep an eye out for whatever unfolds over here. I believe we'll know by tomorrow morning and get a clear understanding of whether there even were strikes and how many were intercepted, if that actually is the case. Let's begin by looking, though, at this Russian advance. Really interesting advance over here that occurred in this region just to the northwest of Verbove. As you can see, the gain is marked in this yellow color. The polygon itself represents this 1 square kilometer piece of territory, and the Russians were able to advance in the northwestern direction, if we're measuring it, about 1 or 1.92 kilometers. What this means is that the Ukrainian positions, whatever soldiers are remaining in these dugouts here just east of Robotyne, either within tree lines, within the actual forested regions that I'm zooming in on right now, within the trenches that were initially built by the Russians in order to withstand the counteroffensive. It doesn't really matter. All of these Ukrainian forces, of which I would say it's probably in the dozens because it can't be any larger, that would simply be inconceivable to have such a large concentration of men in such an exposed area. But within this 3-kilometer range, now escaping that region, it's possible because there is some forested regions over here. And so that will provide the Ukrainians some concealment if they are still present in these southernmost trenches. But still, that really is a narrow sort of strip of land to pass through. And it's definitely being overlooked by the Russians to the west, where they do have control of hills in certain portions of Robotyne. And then to the east, the Russians also have really significant ridges in the regions surrounding Verbove and also just to the northwest. And so the Russians are overlooking the Ukrainian salient from both sides, both in terms of developing it, but also in terms of the pure elevation. And then just imagine how difficult it would be for those groups, those squads, to just pass through this area over here under constant bombardment by the Russians. That really is a difficult situation. And the reason why it's been possible to do this, to sort of tighten the noose and really force Ukraine's hand instead of allowing Ukraine to just prolong time over here and just continue digging in, is due to this geolocation. It's actually a video from July 26th, but it's been geolocated recently. And so we don't know what's been going on in that time period in the week plus that's been since the recording of this video. But it is from the 136th Motor Rifle Brigade. It's a video which shows their soldiers storming a Ukrainian stronghold. And you can see how these strongholds are really built along tree lines and the local road over here, likely built by the Russians, but since then it's been utilized by the Ukrainians numerous times in their defensive activities, as the Russian soldiers really throughout the past 8-9 months have been trying to gradually expand their buffer zone northwest of Verbove. Now they finally reached this sort of northwestern tip of this Ukrainian defense node, which you see marked in this sort of light green color over here. And this was from July 26th, recorded by drones that were also dropping grenades onto the Ukrainian side. And so the Russians, of course, had the drone supports. And as a result, they were able to penetrate rather deep past the Ukrainian front line, sort of ignoring the nearby fields, almost as if they were inconsequential, as if the Ukrainians couldn't really leverage their positions here in order to repel the Russian attacks. And the Russians were able to really pave this very deep cuts into the Ukrainian line that is currently putting a lot of pressure on the remaining Ukrainian squads. And those squads are likely either from the 65th Brigade, but I think it's probably going to be from the 117th Brigade as well, because they have more of a presence in this Verbove region. 65th Brigade is really now tasked with defending in the area north of Robotyne, protecting the outskirts to Novodanilivka and the highway, and also the Russian advances that occurred over the past few days. This 4 square kilometer region just to the northwest of Robotyne, it's also being sort of coalesced under Russian control. And so the Ukrainian garrison here is severely diminished because there really are only 2 brigades of note and perhaps one other that is being rotated in and out. We don't have a full understanding of their activities because they're not really releasing a lot of footage. But definitely in this sort of 2024 period, the Ukrainian garrison here has been so depleted. And that's something that, of course, was understandable once the counteroffensive failed. But then you continue to hold on to the salient, and you're doing so with a smaller amount of forces. And then the inevitable consequence is that even if it takes a long time, the Russian forces will eventually be able to create salients that yield higher casualties and then force the Ukrainians anyways to then withdraw at a certain point. And so that's what we're seeing manifest right now. And the Ukrainian garrison here does not have the wherewithal to counter that. Even though the Russian forces here, it's not like they're at full capacity. They've also moved certain elements away to fight in other parts of the front line. But they do still have a rather solid base of sort of support here along the Surovikin line, along key nodes like Verbove and Novopokrovka, utilizing the Surovikin line as a sort of rear line for coordination. And so you could see that the unit that actually conducted the advance for the Russian forces, if I have it marked over here, is this brigade over here. But there are plenty of other air assault units in the region. And so the Russians really are trying to shape the battlefield here, whatever garrison is still present in the region, in order to one day have the means in really make it more conducive for an assault towards Orikhiv. But it's definitely not, when you're looking at the higher command, a key objective at the present moment. Because right now, one of the most important targets is this General Pokrovsk Direction and actually reaching that city, being able to fire shorter range artillery directly towards Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. And the Russians every day are getting closer to achieving that objective. And so over here, you could see that the Russian forces, based on the yellow markers, have been able to advance deeper and deeper along the rail axis. We're going to look at 3 different areas where they gained. So first direction is just north of Jelane. As I've said numerous times, and now it's actually unfolding, the Russian forces at this point, they really care less about securing the entirety of an open field in a certain region and are just trying to advance and put a lot of resources through one specific path in order to quickly reach the Ukrainian lines in the Ukrainian villages, and then sending DRGs through that axis in order to just sort of deconstruct any sort of Ukrainian defensive effort or preparation. So that's what we saw here. We saw the Russians very quickly rush out of the rail line and make it all the way to northern Jelane. Now that they've been present over here for maybe 3 days, the Russian forces have essentially been provided the rest of the fields here because the Ukrainians have no means of resisting in these regions. They would be too cut off, and they prefer to actually hedge their bets on defending within a populated region. And so then by extension, a couple of days later, all the nearby fields also fall into Russian hands. So here you can see that 0.8 square kilometer piece of territory that the Russians captured. They really are inching near on all fronts towards this village, where the Ukrainians, despite that fact, they are trying to hold out for as long as possible, using, of course, reinforcements from the 47th Brigade, as always. And then looking a bit westward, this is also a very concerning part of the front line. You can see the Russians were able to advance in total, get control over nearly 2 square kilometers of territory. What's important is that the Ukrainians have not been able to stop the Russians once they entered into the residential regions, because at that point you would expect the fighting to get more bogged down because you're going from house to house, to basement to basement. And this region should not really be that damaged because it's only recently become a part of the front line. And so you'd expect that the Ukrainian garrison would be able to put up a more protracted resistance like they've had in plenty of other cities or villages. But this time it is different because of how quickly the Russians arrived here, how much it took the Ukrainians back, and how little organization they had in this rear region. And so the Russian forces, over the past 24 hours, they've been able to advance 400 meters deeper, and they are very close to reaching the center of the village, which includes these various ponds, warehouses. And so now the Russians are just inching closer in that direction. They're also continuing to advance along the rail line, which makes a lot of sense because, again, we're talking about how the Russians have decided to bypass the open fields nearby. They're not really conducting vehicular assaults through these open fields, and instead they're opting to send in first infantry and DRGs through the windbreaks, then motorcyclists, and only afterwards sending in the large armored columns to take over the more difficult Ukrainian static defensive positions. But in a lot of these regions, besides the drones, which of course are a large concern, the Russians are not as contested in their advances. And you can see that generally this region is rather open. There is actually an opportunity for the Russians to continue advancing for another, let's see, maybe nearly 3 kilometers in the southwestern direction before they reach another region where there are populated settlements that the Ukrainians may try to coalesce around. And this is why the Russians are trying to just, as soon as possible, advance to these regions. They want to make sure to secure as much land as possible in favorable positions, which I'll mark an X over here on the rail embankment that overlook Mykolaiivka or Orlivka. And most importantly, if you extend it northwards, these fields also overlook Khodivka, which is now a part of the Russian bucket list of taking over in the near future. And of course, I can say the same thing about Novohordivka. But we're going to get into so much more detail about that in future videos when there's less updates that I need to urgently cover. And so just as you guys see over here with the yellow marker, the Russian forces have also been able to infiltrate into Serhivka. Again, the Russians created a wedge using the rail station, and the Ukrainians, most of their resources have been directed towards Yelena in this region. There are question marks about which unit is even defending around Serhivka. If there are units around here, then a lot of them may be scrambling to build up an impromptu defense line in the regions just west of it. And so then there's a question of who's even left, which platoons are left to even resist in Serhivka, which is really, when you look at it, the opposite of the ideal village that you want to defend. It's the antithesis of that, because not only is it overlooked by the Russians to the east where they're attacking through, but it's also being flanked from 2 directions. And it's a rather small village with really just one main road that has to get passed through, and there aren't any trenches in the region, just a few bushy areas that the Russians are trying to take over right now. And so all in all, I see the fate of this hamlet being very similar to ones like Vesele that are of similar size and were in a similar geographic state. And so you could see already the direction that it is going in, and that of course will give the Russians more of the momentum needed to approach Hordivka from a new direction. So just keep an eye out for the sort of developments around Serhivka and any footage from that region. Looking at Ivanivka, the Russians have been able to push deeper into the village. This one is slightly larger than a few of the other ones that we talked about today. But in general, the Russian forces are again solidifying control today over large swaths of fields that the Ukrainians simply did not have the means by which to hold on to. It would, even if they could hold on to it in their disorganized states, then it would be in such an exposed area that it would yield very high casualties. And so the Ukrainians were opting, of course, to try to pull back their forces into populated regions. Ivanivka is the best example because it is a bit more complex and intricate in terms of the road structure. You could see that there are some some sort of choke points in this region that the Ukrainians could take advantage of. There's also more forested regions, and there's a center with a few structures. So it does have a slight advantage, but also, again, the Russian forces are advancing from higher elevated regions along the rail embankment towards the valley on which Ivanivka is located, an extension of the river valley from the Toretsk River just to the north. And again, the Ukrainians really do have to maintain control over Ivanivka. I do think that they will try to send in whatever reinforcements are necessary in order to continue holding on to it, because the fall of Ivanivka then would really put the Ukrainians in Lysychne and Severodonivka in a difficult situation. And by extension, the entire Donetsk line or Toretsk line would be in grave threat. And then just looking westwards, Hordivka would be in even more danger. The Russians would only be at that point, if we're measuring it out, let's see, maybe 3-4 kilometers away from the town. And that's something that really would have surprised a lot of the Ukrainian command in this region if I were to say that a month and a half ago. But just to zoom in, you could see also that according to Ukrainian sources like Deep States, there is this rather interesting gray zone that extends along this entire tree line on the eastern perimeter of Ivanivka. I don't know why that is. Maybe they have some sort of information about Russian DRGs active here. And if that were to be the case, then it would mean that even here in Ivanivka, right next to the village, the defense line is already being infiltrated and already, being diminished and degraded. So just keep an eye out for that as well. Russian forces advanced as well through open fields, 1 kilometer in the northwestern direction towards the hamlet of Lysychne. The Russians really are closing in on it and trying to take it over directly in the same way they did in Timofivka. Now, moving on to the Toretsk axis, the situation here is really important to monitor because what we're seeing now is a collapse of an ideal Ukrainian line. I talked about it for so long because I saw the potential for it, and I'll explain why again. But I did genuinely think that the Ukrainians, based on the sort of line in the road that was marked in the sand and the sort of nearby positions, that the Ukrainians did have an opportunity here to sort of drag out the fighting and buy enough time over the course of weeks or maybe even more for the Ukrainian rear in Toretsk to really be prepared for that intense urban battle. But it appears that even with a manpower disadvantage, the Russian forces have been able to penetrate the lines here and just very quickly bypass through a lot of imagined defenses here. And we already saw that first hole exposed when the Russians crossed over Zalizhnya, and we saw DRGs near the substation yesterday. We also saw the Russians crossing over the sort of diagonal road that I talked about as a sort of potential defense line, crossing over that, taking over houses in the nearby regions, and beginning to flank one of Ukraine's key strong points in the region, this particular slag heap that has been used, and even until its dying embers, will be used by the Ukrainians as a forward vantage point and a firing point towards the advancing Russian forces. What this means is that now these same Russian DRGs, of which there are many, are going to have access to a vast amount of forested regions. Of course, they can't fully secure it on their own, but for this period of time, they're going to have this access in all the paths that they need to enter into this vast arena of fields, and that will give them, or not fields, of forests, and that will give them a vector through which to begin very intensive sabotage operations, reconnaissance operations on the Ukrainian defenses that are located in the hinterlands between the suburbs and Toretsk, and then actually reaching into the eastern suburbs of Toretsk itself. And it could also put in danger this sort of Zabalka district. It's the southernmost district of Toretsk over here. It is a bit more isolated than the center of the city. And, just to the east, its perimeter is just fully enclosed by this forest. And the Russians already have the wherewithal to begin entering into that region. And so that's also going to play a role in preventing the Ukrainians from building another sort of impromptu defense line like they tried doing over here. And you could very clearly see what the Ukrainians were trying to do once the Russians surprised them in late June. They tried building all of these trenches, and a lot of them were already in place along this road over here that sort of passes through a lot of the suburbs like Zalizhnya and Pivnishnya in particular, and then connects all the way to the rail line in the north. And then in order to act as a fabric between all these trenches that are being built in this sort of diagonal manner, you have these two slag heaps over here that were supposed to overlook the Russians and just keep them at bay for as long as possible. But it appears that despite the fact that a lot of reinforcements were moved into this region to do that task, fulfill that defensive task, it just appears that the moving in of so many units in such a quick amount of time, and a lot of them already being tired to a certain extent, being rotated from other parts of the front line that are high in intensity, it simply didn't bode well. They weren't able to coordinate attacks perhaps correctly. They weren't able to coordinate the defense in a timely manner, and do so while there was still sustained Russian pressure during the Russians' offensive activities that never really stopped in this region. For about maybe 2-3 weeks, there was a period where the front line stabilized around here, and that probably was due to the influx of defenders, but it could also be due to the fact that the Russians, they are limited in manpower in this region, and it's not because in general they're limited in manpower, but it's because when you zoom out, you see that most of the units in this theater are involved in the fighting in the southwest in the Pokrovsk direction. And so really a very small particular sort of assortment of units have been assigned in this operation in Toretsk, and it could increase in the future depending on the assessment of the Russians, and they do have the means to do that, because I know a lot of new territorial motor rifle regiments have been created in the city of Donetsk recently, but that's neither here nor there. Despite that fact, they may have had a bit of a rotation period, rest period, after fighting intensely from sort of late June into mid-July, and now we're beginning to see the amplification of Russian attacks over here, taking over in rather short periods of time, and largely on foot, large amounts of residential blocks, apartment buildings, crossing over into key roads in very deep into these suburbs, for instance. So in Zalizhnya, almost all of it is under Russian control, and then zooming northwards, about 70% of Pivnishnya is under Russian control. And we saw that with the sort of Russian gain that occurred over here starting yesterday. And if we combine the gains from yesterday and today, We could see the Russians took over 2 square kilometers within a hotly contested suburb within 48 hours. That is a really large amount in comparison to everything we saw in other cities where there was urban combat, for instance, in Severodonetsk or Bakhmut. It really is a large amount. And then to zoom in, over the past 48 hours, the Russians advanced about 2.5 kilometers. And then if you look at the past 24 hours, it's somewhere in the ballpark of 1.2 kilometers. And remember, they're doing this while cutting through some of the ideal defense placements for the Ukrainians. You can see them marked in yellow over here, built in this sort of connecting between the eastern and western parts of Pivnishnya. And now that cannot be utilized because the Russians are present over there. Now, the proof of all this is coming from the Ukrainian side. We talked about the Humvee ambush yesterday, so that's not too important. So there was a big back and forth while the Russians tried solidifying control over here. And you did have mobile assets of the Ukrainian military try to counterattack, but the Russians were able to repel those counterattacks. Looking northwards, this is from August 5th. It's from the umbrella unit of the 32nd Mechanized Brigade. Their FPV hit a Russian squad in a house, and the house is geolocated to this marker. Then the Russians got out. They hid in another ruins of a house because all the houses here are basically just complete carcasses of what they previously were. And then that squad was struck in the other house. And so again, you're seeing a lot of activity from drone units, which becomes easier for them when a lot of these houses are partially exposed due to artillery craters and such. And that's what we saw over here. A Russian advance a bit deeper into Druzhba, about 300 meters, but it's just a part of the general Russian advance that's occurring westwards into Pivnishnya, which we see confirmed over here. This is from a 3-minute video released by the Liu Police Brigade, which is a very interesting unit because some of its elements are currently defending in Vovchansk, but it is split up, and a lot of its units are actually over here in the Toretsk region. And so just to give you an example of the unit that was filming this video that I talked about, is the NA, I think that's how you say it, Police Battalion, a rather new unit that I was not aware of. And they were working in conjunction with the 138th Special Purpose Center, which is also a part of the general Ukrainian National Police Service that is currently fighting. And so they released this 3-minute compilation of fighting. They go and comb through various houses, and you can see that they are less dense in nature. I don't actually know if they're from the Pivnishnya suburb. Honestly, based on the sort of houses there, a lot of them looked more rugged, and a lot of them, there were just one story, no apartments nearby, a lot of forestry. It could be this part of Pivnishnya, but it could also be the western portions of it. It could even be in some of this hinterland region in between the Russian line and Toretsk itself over here. This is also a rather rural area, you could say, in comparison. I guess you have to call it suburban, but again, it is less dense. And so we don't actually know if all of the video footage that was filmed by the Ukrainians here in this 3-minute compilation is actually from this part of the front line. So we're going to have to wait for new geolocations, which could potentially show that the Russians have infiltrated even deeper with DRG squads. But of course, now we know that there is a ground presence of the Ukrainians trying to counter that with these national police units. And, they do have armed with them anti-tank missiles, for instance. They engaged in firefights with the Russian soldiers. They showed at least one of them killed afterwards during an engagement. They have, of course, grenades that they throw into ruins, for instance. And so, yeah, they do still have some sort of level of equipment, these Ukrainian forces that are defending here. And then in this video, what we show on the screen, actually, with the marker, is a strike that was conducted, I believe an FPV strike, onto a Russian squad. Maybe like 6 people were in the squad, and they were amassing near a house. And you could see that it's generally just past this highway region over here. This is a really important highway. Extends from Mayorsk and then goes all the way through Toretsk itself. And now the Russians have crossed over. It's no longer going to be used as a means by which the Ukrainians could basically defend the approaches of Western Pivnishnya, which is now thoroughly exposed from the southern flank over here, but also from the eastern flank. And so a lot of pressure is going to be put onto this sort of final Ukrainian suburban node. But also Druzhba is now within the focus of the Russians because it is basically connected to Pivnishnya besides the rail line in between. And then also, based on this Russian advance, they have this really important flanking opportunity from the north that could actually allowed the Russians to very quickly take over the second slag heap over here, where there also are a lot of defenses. And the implication would be that the two strong points that the Ukrainians would have relied on to defend over here would be gone, and it would be gone rather quickly. And then there would be no glue connecting together this 3 kilometer line that is defending currently against the Russian rather broad infiltrations throughout the entire Toretsk line. And then that's when the big issues begin to occur, because the Russians will then begin to utilize the slag heaps for their own gain, like they did in Avdiivka when they took over the Terrakhon. That will overlook large swaths of the forested regions and also much of the heartland of Toretsk. And then it would also give the Russians, of course, the ability to then push deeper and deeper in. And so that's the course we're headed in. But that shouldn't change the fact that Toretsk itself, the heartland of it, is still extremely dense with a lot of massive positions, high elevated positions that the Ukrainians do still control. So just keep that in mind. But the suburbs of Toretsk, which really should have acted as a way for the Russian forces here that are they're finite, they're not infinite. Just to make it clear, they do have finite resources here in terms of manpower, especially. It could have been a way for the Russians to get bogged down in a very similar way to Volchansk at a certain point, where the Russian garrison there has sort of stalled. And there are a lot of reasons for that. A lot of it also due to the fact that the Russians aren't prioritizing it right now. But then on the other hand, here, they simply were unable to do that. And so you could see that it's a massive lost opportunity for the Ukrainians and will have a lot of ramifications going forward for the urban battle that will begin to unfold in this region. Now, I want to talk about the troop sizes, because it really is incredible that the fact that the Russian unit that is mainly conducting these operations is from the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade over here. This is the main unit that is conducting everything. And within that unit, there are a lot of regiments that you may recognize, like the 109th Motor Rifle Regiment. And there are at least 2 other ones that are territorial units that were newly created that are under the umbrella of this brigade. So it's a rather large structure, but it is unified. And that's the sort of contrast between the Ukrainian garrison, where it's just this motley crew of various units, not some of them not even within, of course, the armed forces of Ukraine, some of them being police units, for instance, but they're all being put together and rather quickly, and a lot of them did not have the proper rest beforehand, going up against this sort of unified Russian body, even if it is smaller. But in terms of firepower, they do have a lot of support from artillery within Orikhiv. So in that regard, they're not less significant. And so if you're looking at the size of the Russian garrison in Toretsk that's pushing forward, it's probably in the ballpark of around 8,000. That's sort of the high-end estimate for a large Russian battalion, although I think most of them are probably smaller than that. You also have rumors about the Prizak battalion or LPR unit that may be operating around here, but there is a bit of obscurity about the unit. We don't know if it's actually over here, or ambiguity, I meant to say. And then also you have the Veterans PMC, which includes a lot of former Wagner mercenaries and DPR mercenaries that are fighting here. I don't know their size, but it is supposed to be some sort of battalion size. So maybe it's high hundreds, low thousands, something of that sort. And when you combine that with the fact that certain elements of this brigade are also fighting in New York, so not all of the 132nd Brigade is fighting in Toretsk, you could say that, give or take, it is probably around 8,000 that are advancing right now through Toretsk suburbs. Then on the Ukrainian side, if we're to do the math, looking at the units that are present around here, let me zoom out for a second and show you guys that. So looking at it, of course, you have the 32nd Brigade located here generally, also around Pivnishnya. You have, of course, the elements of the Lyut Brigade. Just to mention the elements of that brigade, which is rather large, I do think that it is larger than the average Ukrainian brigade, because it has become an umbrella in a sort of hodgepodge of various smaller units that didn't have any sort of formalized structure. So the Ukrainians just threw all of them together under the Lyut umbrella, and now they are actually working together as a part of the same units. But again, they become split once again, because half of them are fighting over here and half of them are in Volchansk. But to zoom in for a second, the elements of Lyut that are here include the Luhansk 1 Regiment, the Inay Battalion, like we said before, and Safari Assault Regiment. And so then you look at that, and also at the 95th Airborne Brigade, it's fully operating here. 100th Brigade is fully operating around here. You see their Voron drone unit located in this region, really involved with the actual strikes on Russian soldiers that are advancing. And then you also have a certain quantity of special force Russian or units, special force units from the Ukrainian side, including over here you see marked the 8th Special Purpose Regiment. A lot of them coming from the Omega Detachment, which also has a certain detached or a certain split presence between Toretsk and the Hliboke sector and the sort of Liptsi axis, you could refer to it as. And then just zooming in once again, you can see that there's also the 138th Special Purpose Center. So when you're adding that all together, and perhaps also the Hertz Regiment over here, an Air Assault Regiment, you're thinking about 3 brigades that are here in their entirety. You're thinking about various regiments from Liut. You're thinking about the sort of detached National Guard elements or special forces. In total, when you add that up, it's between probably 12,000 if you're on the lower end, then maybe 10,000. But again, that is at least on par or even more than the Russian side, and the Ukrainians are the defender here with a lot of the dug-in positions. And so it really is interesting to see how, despite that advantage, a lot of that has really been superfluous in preventing a Russian advance. And maybe part of it is because certain elements of these units are actually defending on the rear, trying to build up the rear. And so it's not accurate to say that every single one of those individual men that I said 12,000 of are actually fighting. That is definitely true. It's much smaller than that on a day-to-day basis. But I'm talking about the general sector and where those members of those units are present, and it's around here. And so that's all for today. I know I said I'd talk about Chassis VR, but you could see the gain over here in yellow, and I'll go into more detail about it tomorrow. The video is getting pretty long. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.